Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Ranjodh Dhaliwal, to discuss race, class, and computation. His research interests are media studies, science and technology studies, race, labor, and political economy. Today we want to discuss his recent publication, The Cyber Homunculus, on race and labor in plans for computation. In other words, we're going to have a larger discussion on computing, labor, and race. I want to start by noting that in the discussion in your work, you talk about the creation process of new technologies, and we don't have a vocabulary often to talk about these technologies, so we use what we have in our existing world and existing social relations and even the structures. So they provide us with a vocabulary, a basis for descriptions. So we have gates, we have streams of data, channels of circuitry, motherboards. These terms from current society, culture, economy, and politics seep into the everyday vocabulary and lexicon and go undetected. It leads to a situation in which we are consciously or unconsciously perpetuating systematic harm. For example, the term master or slave to describe hardware or software systems. So some of the key concerns Dr. Dhaliwal talks about are social-technical systems, social-political implications, and a semiotic understanding of what we mean by computation. Again, thank you for joining us. Sorry for the long introduction. There's much to be said about your background and your writings. Maybe we could start with something simple. What's the difference between analog, digital, and quantum computing?
Thank you for having me back. It's such a pleasure. Analog, digital, and quantum are essentially ways of doing computation. The easiest way to understand that is to say, if I have to calculate something, I could either do it digitally, which is to say discretely. I could add 2 and 2, like I have 2 apples and 2 oranges, I'm adding them and I can see 4 oranges. Or I could have 2 gears, one of which I turn by a certain amount, that is almost 2, and the other one I turn by a certain amount, that is almost 2, and the third gear connected to them turns a certain amount that's kind of like 4. I would have done an analog computation. I did not do 2 clicks. I turned it by a certain amount, and it worked analogically.
So that analog is different than an abacus or a pencil and paper? I mean,
absolutely, especially from an abacus, because an abacus will have only discrete units, right? Yes. So that we are in the realm of the digits. Digits being literally the hand fingers, which one by one, like I can't have 1.15 fingers. But in an analog computer, you can obviously have partial numbers. Quantum is a far newer mode of computation that relies on quantum physics and principles of superposition that I would not bore you with. But essentially, it allows us to have multiple bits, which are these simple units, operate in multiple states at the same time. Quantum physics, it's basically kind of like rocket science, so pretty easy.
So in the current period that we're in right now, who has access to analog and digital computation? I mean, who can get that?
Right. I think that's actually in some ways always been the primary question, is to say it's not just about these technologies, but who has these technologies and what they can do with it. So analog computing still remains with us. There are people who use slide rules that are essentially analogical ways of calculation. Aircraft engineers often use slide rules to quickly check their calculations. They have it in their pockets often. There's also a large part of academic world that wants to sort of research analog computing more and more. Digital computers, we all have it. Our phones are digital, et cetera, et cetera. Quantum, far more located. Only very big research centers, companies, and a few universities with enough budgets are able to have quantum computers. But yes, the distribution of computing and who has it is prime question for what happens to our world today and in the future.
Yeah, I often think of Chicago or Hammond or even South Bend for that matter, that even to have electricity
Yeah.
sometimes is beyond a family.
Yeah.
But when we think about having access to computers, right, during the COVID epidemic, one of the things was said, well, they may have one computer at home, but they've got 3 kids, and 3 kids can't be on the computer taking their classes at the same time. So that access is partly limited by your socioeconomic position, and I would say probably a lot has to do with race and gender inequalities.
Absolutely. And that has always been the case. So the penetration of computing and access issues have always sort of been differentially marking. So computers once were only owned by big corporations, and even when they became personal, it wasn't as if everybody was liberated into owning a computer. It was a certain class of people who could actually pay the money to buy it. That was the rise of the hobbyist class in the 1980s. But I think it's worth noting that even access may be a somewhat limited framework, because even if you have access to computation, not all kinds of computing power are made equal. So, computers that are used in prisons look very different than computers that are used in computer laboratories, than the personal ones that you may buy off the shelf, than the ones that may be accessible to someone in rural Brazil. My point there being that there was a moment in time when often people imagined that giving people access to computation would actually help solve inequality.
Democracy is going to be widespread.
Exactly, but computing carries with it some other protological formations, which is to say some other forms of controlling and delineating power that may not just be solely a question of I have it and you don't. If I have a worse one, or if I have one that's locked in certain ways that only allows you to see what I am doing but not vice versa, we have an unequal relationship despite the fact that both of us have computers.
Yeah, and certainly the big data companies know every keystroke we put on the key or on our phones, but we don't know what they're doing with that data.
Absolutely. And where that data goes, who owns it. I mean, there's a whole industry of data brokerage that actively sells our stuff out there. And we don't know where it is stored. So the movement of data across geographic boundaries and data centers in remote areas that we have no control over or no knowledge over is an important political and social issue, I think, of our times.
Well, thank you for that. We're going to have several questions here that I'm going to ask you to explain to the viewers so everybody's kind of understanding what we're talking about. But you write about the cyber homunculus. Homunculus. I understand its roots is that the idea was that there was a tiny little human being inside this machine, and it was doing or contributing to the development of our technology. So, and one of the things you write in your article is that there's a whole level of violence that goes with this homunculus.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I think the best way to understand the cyber homunculus is the fact that anytime in the history we have had to imagine computer as a machine that does some task for us, we have often resorted to imagining a smaller being inside it that does it for us. So the clearest way is something that we interact with all the time but don't really notice is when you send an email and it bounces back, the message you get is called a mailer daemon. Daemon here is a theological figure, a helper, a kind of a homunculus, a supernatural being, yet modeled after humans. But we don't actually know what demons are running in our computers. Like, demon is a technical term. There are several kinds of demons controlling and making sure, they're kind of like small police people controlling the cyber waves. And we only interact with them when something goes wrong, when an email bounces. You hear from your mailer daemon. So my point in that is that there are these implicit ideas about work, about visibility, about opacity, about who controls whom and who does work for whom that get kind of baked into our formations of computation and network cultures that we often don't think about when we think about, say, questions of access, because we're not thinking of questions of differential, even within the access. And that is something that I'm trying to reach through a careful study of the history of computing and the kinds of ways in which it's imagined to be working.
Before we had computing, we just had the introduction of machines. I mean, you go all the way back to the Luddites in England, right? They're going to have a steam engine, and it's going to run the looms, and you're going to have to do more labor in the short amount of time. So it's not like computers to replace labor is something new, because
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, you could even argue the plow with an ox in the front was a form of introducing a mechanical way of plowing the land, so you could go from here to there a lot easier.
Absolutely. I think it gets complicated, so I want to like sort of pull it one by one. I think there is some interesting differences between tools and technologies. Well, some thinkers claim, but not going to go in deeply into that. But nevertheless, there are continuums there with the plow that one might think about. But even within the kind of technological history of the last 200-300 years, whether we go back to the Jacquard loom or practices such as that, it is worth noting that computing is somewhat interesting, because even in its very linguistic origin, the word computer stood for humans before it stood for the machine. So it's almost unlike anything else in that the word computer literally means this is the replacement for a human. So initially, when the word computer was introduced, to me point to a machine, the technical phrase that was used in the 1940s was a machine to replace the work done by a computer. So that eventually gets shortened to computer.
A computer was the person that actually did the computing.
Absolutely. It was a calculator. It was often a low-paid job that did long calculations sitting on a desk in a big space with a pen and paper.
You also suggest in the same article that understanding and valuing the cyber homunculus is crucial for comprehending the relationship between technology, labor, and our own subjectivity. That seemed like a very profound but dense concept, right? So you've got this little creature, but it isn't a little creature, but we think like there's a demon inside our computer, and it's responding, it's doing the work for us. So somehow that labor that used to be done by actual physical labor is now being done technologically, and somehow that's going to affect our own subjectivity?
Yes. Well, I do think so. I think the way that could be understood is as a bipartite movement. The first is to understand that how we understand ourselves in relationship with the world does change over time, and that very easily you can say me as a citizen is a somewhat different idea than me as a user, right? As a citizen, I may have rights. As a citizen, I may be expected to vote, actually, like, that's my public duty. But as a user, I get kind of dictated the rights. There is a long agreement that I read.
Oh yeah, you have to. If you don't agree with it, you can't use it.
Exactly. So, which is to say, the user as a role, as a subject, is a slightly different concept and a different sense of being that you and I have already sort of understood, right? Like if Google sends me an email saying, sorry, your prices of this have increased, I don't necessarily think that I have too many recourses. Yep. As a citizen, I might actually say, I'm going to show up at the city hall. And that's a distinction to be made. That is the subjectivity part, which is to say our interactions with these technologies does have different impacts on our subjectivities.
Does that mean we are less of a citizen, more of a consumer, or
Absolutely.
more of a user? I mean, there's always that shift, like somehow you live in the United States and you have all of these choices, and that makes you access to more democracy, but the different choices of toothpaste or computers, for that matter,
yes,
you're still being a consumer, so you can have what you can afford, so to speak.
Absolutely. But I think even within that, there is a slight distinction between being a consumer and a user. Because being a user means that actually you may not even have that pretense of a choice that you have when you see 12 Colgates on the shelf. Because in this case, given how the industry has developed over the last 50, 60 years, there is a sort of increasing monopolization of a few companies. That means that, regardless of which iPhone we have, we all
There's 2 or 3 models.
exactly. So it's even less of a pretense, I think, in that regard. I think the question of the homunculus here is somewhat different, and I can address that. But the user, I think, is an important thing to think about. That we often
That shifts our subject position
Absolutely.
from citizen to user and or consumer.
Absolutely.
And that seems to narrow our ability to be human.
and our ability to act, our ability to respond, our ability to resist, our ability to protest, our ability to demand.
Yeah.
And
Yes,
yeah.
that's true. I mean, even if you go on X
Yeah.
or Facebook or something and you're going to post something, there may be an algorithm that's hidden that said, no, you can't say that because you violated
Exactly.
our rules. But you can't challenge those rules because you're not a citizen, you're
Yes.
simply a user.
And you also signed,
You signed-
you clicked on the agree on the 300 page,
right.
that you just scrolled through. So, yeah, it's a legal framework created that we take for granted too often. That wasn't necessarily the case for large parts of our civic life up until now. Postal system had very different rules than email systems do. And I think that's something to think about. Like, you could complain to a postmaster general, but I don't remember the last time I picked up the phone and called Gmail to complain about an email that was late.
Yeah. I don't think they'll answer. Well, it might be a call center somewhere else. So.
Probably.
One of the things you write about in this essay is miniaturization, that somehow on a macro level, I mean, we're talking miniaturization, but at the same time we're talking a macro level, that it affects our social relations that seem to work inside of these man-made objects, which may be quantum or digital or even analog. So is that a suggestion that we have to adapt to the machines that we're using, whether that's a previous machine, plow,
Yeah.
a loom, or the current machines, which are computers? Are we adapting to what they allow us to do? And how does that affect our larger social relations in the society?
I think yes, we always adapt to the machines. We don't necessarily have to, but we do, and that has to do with the social relations that we live in. But in this particular specific case, miniaturization is merely the practice of imagining the world that we see and then saying, what if I made it smaller so that it would do the thing that the world does?
Smaller and faster.
Smaller and faster and more. If you have more of these demons, then more emails can be sent and patrolled. And yes, we do often adapt, and that changes how we look at the world. So to give you one specific example, there has been studies that show, and this is also experientially true if we ask ourselves or our friends, from the moment that I grew up reading survey maps, and after the advent of first the GPS and then ubiquitous use of
Try to find a map now.
Yeah. and try to navigate according to a written map, or try to orient yourself in a city. Even the practice of saying go 3 blocks up north starts taking a backseat to a map that tells you 1 minute away, even if it's right there, which is essentially a way of exteriorizing capacities that we had once upon a time in our head, even in a short time period.
But we lose them.
We lose them. So we exteriorize them, and we now are relying on this machine to do it. But then, again, as you can imagine, if there are no real bounds to how this location-based services work, who controls it, et cetera, we get into really thorny territories about what parts of ourselves we are giving away.
One of the other things that I found interesting was you talk about automation in the context of displacing human labor, which again, we go back to each time a new machine was created, the primary purpose was, as you said, with the computer, to replace the actual person that does the computing. So I guess, in a nutshell, how is computation labor? Or how is the production of computation labor? I mean, I know Apple has 1.5 million workers somewhere in the world.
Yeah.
But how, because when, like you said, you have your computer and you're not thinking about the people that made it, the coltan that was dug in the Congo, and all the pollution that goes with it, and what's going to happen to it when it wears out. All those things are not there because it's just you and your computer. But there seems to be a requirement to have somebody actually put the thing together, get the material. So,
absolutely. I mean, I think computation is labor in many ways, one of which you just mentioned, which is to say that the production of computation is often secondary in the way that we imagine the world, but it is produced by labor dispersed all across the world in these specific configurations.
It's kind of like in England, and they would get imported cotton from India or from the United States. Nobody's thinking about the people that are doing backbreaking labor or slavery in the U.S. They're just, oh, isn't this a nice piece of cotton?
Exactly. Here's a thing from Manchester, right? So the whole back end of it kind of gets lost. The person who grows the indigo, the people who like sort of spin and whatnot. It's just the last end point where in our case
there's a whole bunch of labor that went into it to get it to you.
Absolutely. I mean, it cannot happen without civil wars in Central Africa. There is genuinely a link there. But I think, so that's one way in which computation quite literally has these labor backends that we don't think about. The other part is the way that I said that in the very idea of computation, there is a labor displacement happening. Computing is something that was done by a human, and we said, no, now this machine does it. But I think then there are further interesting ways in which computation is labor, because all these practices and protocols that control or that basically make our computing worlds work kind of go undetected when we are actually working with it. Like, we don't actually necessarily think of all the open source software or all the things that actually may be required for my computer to work as it is, but there is all kinds of, there's some person in a basement in Nebraska patching one open source software that is necessary to keep the thing that you're doing going. And then furthermore, I think it also is involved in really important questions of automation and descaling that have been a backbone of the last 150 years of the American industrial history. So the introduction of machines, how jobs change with it, and how we see ourselves in relationship with the machines, whether we fear them or whether we embrace them or whether we encourage production of jobs or the loss of jobs are all contentious issues where computation is connected with labor to a really, really strong degree.
Yeah, and I thought you were also going to speak about the actual labor that's displaced when I'm at my computer, because if I didn't have the computer, I'd be writing it out, and then I would have to edit it and copy it and make changes and go back to the But when you're on your computer, you're also laboring in the very fact that you're using the computer.
Absolutely. And in fact, you can actually feel the physical effects of that labor. That's quite literally what ergonomics is, right? It's basically the displacement of what was once a physical labor issue to saying, well, I have a better chair, so I can actually sit on a computer for longer. Yes.
You write towards the end that we need a new social imagination that includes both people, citizens, and programs. So how do these ideas, this imagination that might be possible, challenge the conventional notions of society, which I would say, like who owns it, who decides, the whole capitalist structure that we live under. So how would a social imagination discuss or challenge those? Right? I remember Nancy Pelosi said, we're a capitalist country, we're all capitalists here. It's
she was factually right, whether the past is something that also neatly corresponds to the future we want is a question we can ask, however. But I think in this particular case, the social imagination, I'm borrowing here from other thinkers, but primarily what I'm thinking about is the fact that if we start really thinking about the labor implications of, and the differential implications, race and gender and class, and computers were also often women before, more often women than men before they became machines that are computers, then we will have to think about okay, so how exactly do we understand all these networks of production, of labor, of control that go into the very moment that I'm being a user on my computer? In that moment, if I actually start thinking about all of this, I think it's going to mess up our system a little bit. So this is more a provocation than anything else to ask us and invite us.
Well, to think about it more critically and think about it more fully rather than just, I'm going to get a new computer, right?
Absolutely.
That's all the time we have on our program. Thank you, Dr. Dhaliwal, for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.